Here are the lower ribs. The muscles between them are the intercostals, which we'll see shortly. Here's the left costal arch. Here's the xiphoid process. The anterior abdominal wall and all the abdominal organs have been removed. Now we'll take a look from below. Here's the diaphragm. It's a thin, continuous sheet of muscle with fibers that converge from all around the circumference to insert on this flat tendon, the central tendon of the diaphragm. The diaphragm arises from a line that goes right around the inside of the lower thoracic aperture, with one interruption here. To see the line of attachment, we'll remove one half of the thorax and look from inside. The line of attachment of the diaphragm goes from here on the back of the sternum, along the inside of the costal arch, and round to the tip of the 12th rib. Between the 12th rib and the body of the second lumbar vertebra, the diaphragm arises on each side from the fascia which overlies the two big muscles of the posterior abdominal wall. These are the quadratus lumborum and psoas major muscles. Three important structures pass through the diaphragm: the esophagus and the two main blood vessels of the lower half of the body, the inferior vena cava and the descending aorta. This is the opening for the inferior vena cava, the vena caval foramen. This is the opening for the esophagus, the esophageal hiatus. This is the opening for the aorta. On each side of these two openings, there's a thickening of the diaphragm called a crus, the plural of which is crura. The left crus arises all the way down here on the body of L2. The right crus arises even further down on L3. The two crura arch over the aortic opening, forming the median arcuate ligament. Fibers of the two crura cross over to surround the esophageal hiatus. When the diaphragm contracts, the whole sheet of muscle, together with the central tendon, moves downward, expanding the lungs and causing us to breathe in. As the diaphragm contracts, the structures below it, the contents of the upper part of the abdominal cavity, are pushed downwards, which leads to this bulging of the abdominal wall when we take a quiet breath in. When we're at rest and breathing quietly, inspiration is produced almost entirely by the downward pull of the diaphragm, with little or no movement of the ribs. In quiet expiration, the upward return movement of the diaphragm is produced passively by elastic forces, notably by elastic contraction of the lungs themselves. When we're breathing vigorously, the diaphragm is pushed upward actively by contraction of the muscles of the abdominal wall. These raise the pressure in the abdomen, forcing the upper abdominal organs and the diaphragm upward. Now that we've looked at the diaphragm, we'll move on to look at the muscles that produce movements of the ribs. First, we'll look at the principal muscles that produce inspiration, the external intercostals and the scalene muscles. Here are the external intercostal muscles. They're thin sheets of muscle that connect each rib to its neighbor. Each external intercostal runs from here on the rib above to here on the rib below. They extend from the tubercles of the ribs behind round to the middle of the costal cartilages in front. The fibers of the external intercostals run forward from above downward. To understand how the external intercostals act, we'll look at a simplified model of two ribs. When we apply a pulling force in the direction of the external intercostal fibers, the ribs move upwards. As the ribs move upwards, their ends together with the sternum, move forwards. So the action of the external intercostals produces an upward and forward movement of the anterior chest wall. Next we'll look at the scalene muscles, which assist in inspiration by raising the first and second ribs. Here's the manubrium, here's the first rib, here's the second rib. Here are the scalene muscles, anterior, middle, and posterior. The anterior scalene muscle arises from the anterior tubercles of the transverse processes from C3 to C6. It inserts here on the first rib. The middle scalene muscle arises from the posterior tubercles of the transverse processes from C2 to C6 and inserts here on the first rib. The posterior scalene muscle arises from the posterior tubercles from C4 to C6 and inserts down here on the second rib. The action of the scalene muscles raises the first and second ribs and the manubrium in deep inspiration. Now we'll look at the principal muscles that produce expiration, the internal intercostals and the muscles of the abdominal wall. The internal intercostals lie just beneath the external ones, which we'll remove. Here are the internal intercostal muscles. Each internal intercostal runs from here on the rib below to here on the rib above. The internal intercostals extend from the angles of the ribs behind to the end of the intercostal spaces in front. The fibers of the internal intercostals run forward from below upward. To show how they act, we'll look at the model again with the force now applied in the direction of the internal intercostal fibers. As the force is applied, the ribs move downwards. As the ribs move downwards, their ends, together with the sternum, move backwards. The action of the internal intercostals moves the anterior chest wall downwards and backwards.